blueprint to global power. Can China overtake the US as a global power without any war? In an era where geopolitical rivalries dominate the global stage, the question of which nation will lead the world in the coming decades is increasingly important. One of the most talked about possibilities is the rise of China, a nation that has rapidly ascended to become an economic powerhouse, seemingly following in the footsteps of the United States during its own rise to dominance in the early 20th century. However, there's a key difference. China's strategy for achieving global power appears markedly different from the United States. While the US engaged in wars and military intervention to cement its position, China has managed to avoid military conflict while expanding its influence. Could China's peaceful rise to power replicate the success of the US and, in the process, potentially surpass it? This analysis explores whether China can overtake the US as the world's leading power without resorting to war, much like the US did before World War I. First of all, let us look at the historical context of the US rise to power. To understand how China may be following a similar trajectory, it's crucial to first look at how the United States became the dominant global power in the 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly through its avoidance of military conflict. From the early 1800s until the early 20th century, the US largely adhered to an isolationist foreign policy. Although it expanded westward, acquiring territories and increasing its domestic wealth, it avoided entanglement in European wars. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823, which warned European powers against interfering in the Americas, was an early indication of the United States' intention to focus on internal development rather than military intervention abroad. The impact of World War I. By the early 20th century, the US had rapidly industrialized and was becoming a major economic player on the world stage. However, it remained relatively uninvolved in global conflicts, particularly World War I, in which it did not join the fighting until 1917, years after much of Europe had already exhausted itself in battle. By the time the US entered the war, the European powers were economically shattered, and the US emerged as the world's leading creditor nation, holding vast amounts of European debt. This unique position allowed the US to shape post-war economic recovery, lending money to European nations and establishing itself as the central financial player in global trade. The US also cemented the dollar as the dominant global currency and began to play a key role in the creation of international institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, IMF, which further extended its economic influence worldwide. Post-war strategy. Following World War II, the US used its financial strength and strategic alliances to rebuild war-torn economies in Europe and Japan through programs like the Marshall Plan. The US also played a central role in shaping the post-war world order, controlling global trade networks and positioning itself as the protector of liberal democratic values. Through these actions, the US successfully avoided the devastation of war while leveraging its economic and financial power to dominate the global stage. China's economic growth and avoidance of war. Now, looking at China, a country that has risen from the shadows of historical poverty and conflict, one can clearly see how China's path mirrors the United States' ascent, albeit with a 21st century twist. China's rise. Since the 1980s. Following decades of internal strife, including the Cultural Revolution and Great Leap Forward, China began to open its doors to the world in the late 1970s under Deng Xiaoping's reforms. Instead of military conquest, China focused on economic modernization and industrial growth. During the 1980s, China's economy began to grow exponentially as it embraced market-driven reforms and opened itself up to foreign investment. By the early 2000s, China had become the workshop of the world, manufacturing a significant portion of the globe's goods and becoming a critical player in global trade. Through exports, China accumulated enormous wealth and invested heavily in infrastructure projects, laying the foundation for future growth. The Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. One of the key strategies that has defined China's rise is its Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. Launched in 2013, the BRI aims to invest in infrastructure projects across Asia, Europe, Africa, and beyond. This strategy, often referred to as China's 21st century Silk Road, is a non-military approach to gaining global influence. By financing large-scale projects such as ports, highways, and railroads, China has expanded its reach into developing nations, creating economic dependencies that further strengthen its political influence. Unlike the US, which built its influence through military interventions, China has employed soft power through its economic diplomacy, investing in regions with emerging markets while avoiding direct military conflicts. Military modernization. While China's strategy has largely been centered on economic and diplomatic growth, the country has also modernized its military in response to regional threats. However, its military buildup is primarily defensive and focused on regional security, such as ensuring control over the South China Sea and maintaining stability on its borders. While China has been criticized for its assertive territorial claims, particularly with Taiwan, its military strategy is not aimed at global conquest, unlike the US during its rise to power. Comparison: US and China's paths to global dominance. Now, it's time to compare the strategies employed by both the US and China in their respective rises to global power. Economic power. Both nations use their economic might as the backbone of their global rise. In the early 20th century, the US built its industrial capacity and expanded its influence through financial power and global trade. China, too, has become the world's second-largest economy, with its trade surplus, manufacturing prowess, and growing role in global technology shaping the world order. However, the US used economic power in conjunction with military interventions to secure its interests, while China has largely relied on economic diplomacy to avoid war. China's emphasis on trade agreements and investments in infrastructure projects around the world demonstrates a peaceful approach to gaining global power. Financial influence. After World War I, the US became a global creditor and used its economic dominance to shape global financial institutions. In the same vein, China is making strides to establish alternative financial institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, and to use the yuan as an international currency, avoiding military conflict. While the US engaged in military conflicts to solidify its position, China's rise has been characterized by a deliberate avoidance of war. The US participated in wars like the Spanish-American War, World War I, and World War II, all of which helped it extend its influence. In contrast, China has avoided large-scale military confrontations, focusing instead on trade agreements, diplomatic influence, and technology exports. Current global context. Is China following in the United States' footsteps? US-China rivalry. Today, the US and China are locked in a growing rivalry, particularly in the areas of trade, technology, and military influence. The US has led international efforts to counter China's economic expansion, particularly in places like the South China Sea and Taiwan. However, China's rise is more centered around economic and technological leadership rather than direct military confrontation. China's strategy for avoiding war. China's peaceful rise strategy centers around economic growth and global cooperation, in contrast to the United States' military-based global strategy during its rise. By investing in the infrastructure and development of other nations, China builds networks of interdependence that give it significant global leverage without the costs of war. The risks of China's rise. While China's peaceful rise has brought economic prosperity, it also faces challenges. There is internal pressure, such as an aging population and environmental degradation. Additionally, its geopolitical ambitions in Taiwan and the South China Sea could spark military conflicts. Internationally, Western nations led by the US view China's rise with suspicion and are pushing back on some of its global economic practices. Challenges facing China's rise. Internal challenges. China's aging population and growing economic inequality pose long-term challenges. The government's ability to maintain growth and stability domestically will play a crucial role in determining whether its peaceful rise continues. Global backlash. As China's influence grows, it faces increasing resistance from the US and its allies, who are concerned about China's growing influence in international institutions and trade networks. In summary, China's rise mirrors the early path taken by the US in many ways. Both nations have avoided military conflict while focusing on economic power and leveraging financial influence to dominate the global stage. However, unlike the US, which used military interventions as a tool to assert global dominance, China has relied on trade, investment, and technology to expand its reach. As China continues on its current trajectory, it may very well surpass the US as the world's leading power, economically, politically, and diplomatically. However, whether this rise will remain peaceful or be interrupted by military conflict remains to be seen. China's ability to sustain its peaceful rise will depend on navigating its internal challenges and managing the global backlash as it extends its influence. If successful, China could be the first global power to surpass the US without resorting to war, ushering in a new era of economic dominance and global cooperation. Thank you for watching Freedom Square Global Geopolitical Analysis. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment.
Freedom Square.